Spiritual awakening isn't what you've been sold. Forget the images of people meditating on idyllic beaches with a serene smile. The truth is, a genuine spiritual awakening isn't about finding the light. It's about surviving the fire that burns your life, your beliefs, and your identity down to the ashes. And the harshest truth, the one nobody has the courage to say, is that 99% of people run out of the fire before the real transformation happens. They mistake the heat of the forge for the threat of annihilation. Imagine that your life, with everything you believe yourself to be, is a beautiful and detailed sandcastle. You've spent years building it, proud of every tower, every wall. Spiritual awakening is not a new ornament to decorate the castle. It's the giant wave that appears on the horizon without warning and washes it all away in seconds. The disaster, you see, is not the wave. The real disaster is the desperate attempt to rebuild the exact same sandcastle at the water's edge, foolishly expecting a different outcome. In this video, we're going to do something different. We're going to explore the 6 great filters, the exact breaking points on this spiritual journey, where most people give up and return to the safety of their known prison, rather than facing the terrifying freedom of the unknown. And I'm going to show you why the pain, confusion, and loneliness you might be feeling aren't a sign that you're doing something wrong, but irrefutable proof that you are finally on the right path. It's crucial that you understand, this process is not a single happy event. It's a long, painful, and deeply confusing deconstruction of the false self, a true ego death that unfolds over time. I remember spending sleepless nights, feeling the very ground of my reality disappear from under my feet. The person I thought I was, my ambitions, my relationships, it all felt like old clothes that no longer fit. The feeling wasn't enlightenment, it was pure madness. And it's at that exact point, in that question of, am I going crazy, that the first great filter appears. The disaster in this video's title is not a mistake in the process. It's not the dark night of the soul, or the feeling of isolation. The one and only true disaster is the act of abandoning the journey halfway through out of fear, confusion, or worse, the seduction of a false spiritual identity that serves only as a prettier mask for the same old ego. Today, we're going to shine a light on these traps, so you can walk through them, instead of being stopped by them. It's at this point that the true spiritual journey begins, not with a whisper, but with a roar. Suddenly, the ground of the reality a person knew simply vanishes, a true earthquake of the soul that shakes all certainties. The world's colors seem to fade, and a profound sense of estrangement takes over everything. This is the initial phase of psychic death, one of the most unsettling spiritual awakening symptoms, where the ego's structure begins to crumble without permission, leaving a void in its place. The passions that once moved mountains now turn to ash. Life goals seem like jokes told by a stranger. The person looks in the mirror and no longer recognizes who is there, leading to the agonizing question, am I going crazy, or is this a spiritual awakening? It's a profound loss of identity, a disconnection so intense that isolation becomes almost inevitable. No one around them seems to understand the sudden apathy for what was once the center of their existence. Confronted with this deafening inner silence, the instinctive reaction for most is panic. Humans have a primal fear of the void, and the mind, in its attempt to protect, desperately searches for an escape route. This is where the first great disaster of the path occurs, the escape to noise. The person dives headfirst into work, the gym, binge-watching series, or the infinite scroll of social media, anything to avoid hearing what the silence is trying to say. Imagine being thrown into a completely dark and silent room for the first time. The urge to find the light switch is desperate, almost unbearable. Few understand that the task is not to turn on the light, but to sit in the darkness and wait for their eyes to adjust. External distractions are that frantically sought-after light switch, an attempt to recreate a familiar and controlled environment, postponing the inevitable encounter with what lies hidden in the shadows of one's own consciousness. This frantic escape, while completely understandable, is the first great trap that halts a genuine spiritual awakening. However, some, whether from the sheer exhaustion of running or from a spark of courage, realize that external noise doesn't fill the internal void. It's in this moment of surrender that they begin to search for a different solution, a light that comes not from without, but from within. And that's when they find a new path, one that seems luminous, but hides its own subtle trap. After the desolation of the inner earthquake, the person stumbles upon what seems to be an oasis, the world of spiritual concepts. Suddenly, a new language of high vibrations, co-creating reality, and positive thinking offers an elegant escape from the recent pain. It seems like the perfect answer to the agony of a spiritual crisis, a clear rulebook for a game that seemed chaotic. The promise that one can simply choose to vibrate at another frequency and leave suffering behind is incredibly seductive. This is where a subtle but dangerous performance begins. The person starts policing their own feelings, labeling anger, sadness, and anxiety as personal failures, as signs of a low vibration. Forgiveness is paid lip service to, but not felt in the heart. Gratitude is posted on social media, but not lived in the quiet of their being. This is one of the greatest dangers of spiritual awakening, using newfound knowledge as a gleaming shield against one's own vulnerable humanity. At this point, the second great disaster occurs. The real work to survive spiritual awakening is not about amputating parts of yourself, but about having the courage to integrate the whole. By repressing and rejecting their own shadow, a person doesn't heal it. They only push it down into the psyche's basement, where it grows stronger and more distorted. Toxic positivity prevents a true ego death, as the ego has simply found a nobler and more socially acceptable disguise to remain in control of the journey. The analogy of the moldy basement illustrates this perfectly. The person tries to purify a damp, dark basement just by painting the walls with the white paint of light and lighting the incense of good vibes. For a while, the space even looks cleaner and smells better. But the mold, the pain, the trauma, the unprocessed anger continues to grow beneath the paint, silently. Inevitably, the mold will break through the surface, revealing that the cleansing was just a dangerous and fragile illusion. Maintaining this facade of forced enlightenment requires tremendous energy, and life, with its relentless wisdom, invariably brings storms that stain the white paint. When toxic positivity begins to fail, and the darkness from the basement returns, the ego doesn't surrender. It's smarter than that. It realizes it needs a more robust defense, a more elaborate identity. It no longer wants to just seem spiritual. It wants to be recognized as such, weaving for itself a new and brilliant golden mask. When the fragile dam of toxic positivity breaks, the ego makes its master move. It doesn't fight against spirituality. On the contrary, it hijacks it for itself. The journey, which began as a humble search for relief, transforms into a new project of self-aggrandizement. The person no longer yearns for healing, but for the status of being healed. The question, what is the purpose of a spiritual awakening, becomes corrupted. The purpose ceases to be liberation and becomes the construction of a new, superior persona. Thus begins the phase of collecting spiritual trophies. Courses, retreats, initiations, and certificates become medals of honor to validate this new identity. The person begins to assess others on a scale of evolution, subtly judging friends and family as asleep or stuck in the matrix. The focus of their spiritual journey shifts dramatically from an internal, vulnerable process to an external performance of wisdom, dangerously skimming through the spiritual awakening stages. This is the point of the third and perhaps most ironic disaster. The quest for ego death becomes the raw material for building a spiritual superego. The goal of shedding a false identity morphs into the obsession of building a new one that is more rigid and harder to see through. The person now lives in a golden cage. It looks free and enlightened from the outside, but inside they are more imprisoned than ever, because now they have an enlightened character to defend at all costs. It's exactly as the analogy suggests. The person trades in their old denim jacket of an ordinary person for a heavy golden robe of a spiritual sage. The problem is that this robe doesn't provide warmth. It isolates. It creates a barrier between the person and the imperfect beauty of human connection. They can no longer admit to feeling envy, to being afraid of the future, or to simply not having the answers, as it would tarnish the shine of their sacred costume, deepening a painful sense of isolation. However, this golden mask, no matter how polished, is extremely fragile and suffocating. It prevents the nourishment that comes from vulnerability and genuine connection, as real relationships require authenticity, not a performance of perfection. As the person becomes entrenched in this role, a real shift does occur. Their frequency changes, not through elevation, but through separation. And the world around them, which they once only judged, now begins to truly pull away, leaving them alone with their brilliant robe. Inevitably, the internal transformation begins to spill over, forcibly rearranging the external world. The conversations that were once the fabric of daily life now sound empty, and the social gatherings that brought comfort become an energy drain. The person sits at a table with the people they love but experiences a profound sense of feeling lost, disconnected, as if they're watching a play in which they were once a leading actor. Their reality simply no longer fits the old script. This is the stage where the pain of losing friends during awakening becomes sharp and real. It's not about judgment or feeling superior, but about a fundamental energetic incompatibility. It's like trying to tune an AM radio to an FM frequency. The connections that were built upon an old version of oneself begin to fray, not out of malice, but from a lack of resonance. The isolation that sets in feels like a punishment, but it is actually a painful and necessary process of creating sacred space. I vividly remember being at a family barbecue, a setting that was once the epicenter of my comfort, and feeling like a complete stranger. Listening to the same conversations, the same jokes, I realized I no longer belonged in that world. The temptation to put the old mask back on, to force a laugh just to feel a glimpse of that former connection, was an overwhelming force. To remain true to your new self in that deafening silence is one of the most difficult acts of the entire spiritual journey. Herein lies the fourth great filter, the point of disaster for many. The fear of total loneliness is so visceral that the person commits the ultimate betrayal, the betrayal of their own soul. They dim their own light, agree with things they inwardly reject, and force their presence in environments that suffocate them, all for crumbs of acceptance. They choose the safety of a familiar cell over the terrifying vastness of freedom, abandoning their rebirth so they don't have to attend the funeral of their old life. However, for those few who endure the exile, who find the courage to walk alone, loneliness transforms into solitude, a source of unshakable power and integrity. They learn to be their own home, yet the journey offers them no rest. After surviving the silence of the external world, the path pushes them into an even deeper and more terrifying silence, an inner desert where no one is around, not even the comforting presence of God or the universe to keep them company. After crossing the desert of social exile, a person expects to find a green valley, but instead they encounter the heart of the desert, the dreaded dark night of the soul. The spiritual practices that were once their safe anchors, meditation, prayers, rituals, suddenly become empty gestures, like ash in the mouth. A profound spiritual depression, anxiety sets in, which isn't ordinary sadness, but an existential vacuum where neither pain nor joy can echo. This is the final test of detachment and the rawest answer to the question, why is spiritual awakening so painful? The connection to the divine, the faith in the universe or God that sustained them through the entire journey, simply vanishes. The heavens fall silent. There are no more answers, no signs, no sense of presence. The person feels like a cosmic orphan, utterly abandoned in a silent and indifferent universe, facing the void in its purest and most absolute form. The only analogy that comes close to this experience is that of the caterpillar inside its chrysalis. It doesn't simply grow wings, it completely disintegrates, liquefying into a primordial, undifferentiated soup. There is no guarantee that a butterfly will emerge. This is the true mechanism of ego death. Not a heroic death on a battlefield, but a passive, anonymous, and terrifying dissolution. And the only way of how to deal with the dark night of the soul is to surrender to this process. It is at this point that the fifth and most tragic disaster occurs. Faced with this absolute nothingness, the rational mind collapses and concludes, it was all an illusion. The person believes they have failed, that the spiritual path is a fraud, and they abandon the journey, bitter and disillusioned. They rip open the chrysalis too soon, finding only chaos and goo, and spend the rest of their life convinced that the promise of the butterfly was a cruel lie, never knowing they were just one step away from true birth. However, for the soul that can withstand the vacuum, that surrenders to dissolution without a fight and without demanding guarantees, the silence begins to change in quality. The emptiness ceases to be frightening and reveals itself as a space of pure potentiality, the womb of the real. Having lost all identities, all attachments, and even the idea of an external God, they are finally empty. And only a perfectly empty vessel can be filled by life in its totality, returning to the world in a radically new way. After emerging from the vacuum of the dark night, a person does not become an ethereal being floating above the ground. On the contrary, they land in their own body and their own life with a solidity they have never before experienced. The world around them is the same, but the eyes that see it are radically new. The frantic search for answers in books, gurus, and retreats simply ceases because the question that drove it has dissolved. The sacred is no longer in a distant place. It is the very texture of the present moment. It's here that the question, what is the purpose of a spiritual awakening, finds its final and simplest answer. It is not to escape the human condition, but to dive into it completely and without reservation. Enlightenment is found in the total presence of washing the dishes, in listening attentively to a child, in the feeling of the sun on the skin. The need for extraordinary spiritual experiences vanishes because the extraordinary is finally discovered in the raw beauty of the ordinary, the true key to how to navigate a spiritual awakening. The journey resembles that of a mountain climber who has spent a lifetime obsessed with reaching the summit of Everest. They struggle, suffer, and finally reach the peak, only to find an inhospitable place of wind and ice. It is on the descent, on the return to the valley, that they realize the true beauty wasn't in the destination, but in the strength they developed in their legs and the clarity of the air they breathed. True mastery is not living on the peak, but bringing the vast perspective of the peak down into the simple life in the valley. And here, on this plateau of serenity, the sixth and most subtle disaster can occur. Some souls become addicted to the adrenaline of the climb, to the drama of the spiritual journey. They find the peace and simplicity of ordinary life to be boring, an anticlimax. They don't know how to function without a next level to achieve or a shadow to fight. And so, because they don't know how to appreciate the view, they start looking for a new, higher mountain to climb, completely missing the reward of all their effort. This return to simplicity is not a defeat, but the silent victory. To survive spiritual awakening doesn't mean becoming a superhuman, but a complete, authentic, and integrated human being. The search ends not with a thunder of cosmic revelations, but with the serene silence of one who has finally come home. And understanding this distinction is what separates a journey that blossoms into freedom from one that is eternally lost in the search for it. So as we've seen, getting through the 6 filters and being able to survive spiritual awakening isn't about having a map to avoid the traps. It's about having the courage and awareness to walk through them when they inevitably appear on your path. The disaster, always remember this, is never the earthquake of the soul. It's never the social exile or the darkness of the inner desert. The one and only true disaster is choosing to go back to sleep after having glimpsed, even for a second, what it means to be truly awake. The true face of success on this journey looks nothing like what pop spirituality has sold us. It's not a spectacular enlightenment or the acquisition of mystical powers. It is a quiet, unshakable strength born from the deepest humility. It's the ability to be honest about your own inner mess, the courage to stay with yourself when everyone else leaves, and the wisdom to find a deep and genuine peace in ordinary life, in the simple act of being. So if you are in the middle of the fire right now, if your life feels like it's in ruins and you feel lost, alone, and maybe a little crazy, listen closely. You are not breaking. You are being forged. The fire is not destroying you. It is only burning away what was never truly yours. Don't run. Don't get distracted. Remain. What awaits you on the other side is not an improved, happier, more polished version of you. It is the real you, free of everything you are not. The final question I leave you with is, which part of the fire are you in right now? And the most important choice you will make today is, will you run back to the comfort of what you already know, or will you choose to remain in the fire of transformation? If this video resonated with your journey, if you recognized yourself in any of these painful and necessary stages, I invite you to be part of something. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "I will remain in the fire." Let's create a community of people who are not afraid to go through the real process. A place of strength to remind each other that we are not alone on this crossing. Like this video if it brought you some clarity, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because our conversation is just beginning. We need to have more honest dialogues about the true path of awakening. Now that we understand why people stop, the next crucial question is, how do you keep going when the pain feels unbearable? In my next video, the 3 practical tools for navigating the dark night of the soul, I will share the exact anchors that helped me navigate the most difficult moments and not give up in the middle of the storm. You won't want to miss it. Stay strong. The journey is worth it.